Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to The Right Opinion, the home of a twat with too much free time and TV shows. Honestly, something that I have an interest in, but seldom get around to actually watching. My biggest problem is how much time they tend to consume, and although I promise you I have too much free time, TM, it's not that I typically decide to dedicate all towards one TV show. I like to allocate it across various activities to maintain some mental well-being. Because after all, in this world called YouTube, we can all use that from time to time. I mostly indulge my time in films, which are typically shorter in total, with exceptions, and gaming, because, as I have always asserted, I am a gamer. Nonetheless, recently I have found myself in an interesting predicament because YouTube's slow monetization process has basically delayed so many of my videos that I found myself with a week on my hands, and a desire to cover something slightly different. So without further ado, I suggest we tackle that slightly different subject on this glorious, glorious day. And if you have some basic reading capabilities, you will know that this is 13 Reasons Why. 13 Reasons Why is a TV show that currently spans 3 seasons, although a 4th is expected too, so hooray for that. It is based on the young adult novel by J. Asher, and the first series was released originally in 2017 to a furore of applause and acclaim from critics and audiences alike. However, it is not without its controversy. What is the basis of this controversy? Well, 13 Reasons Why is a show that, like many films and TV series, tackles tough issues. However, one of the central characters and narrators of this show, someone by the name of Hannah Baker, is presenting their narrative from the perspective of a deceased individual. But on top of that, she committed suicide and left behind 13 tapes. These 13 tapes were each addressed to an individual who she felt had played a role in the situation that finally resulted in her death. These tapes would then circulate through each subject, being passed on until they completed their cycle. It is a show that asks questions regarding accountability, school environment, but it's also very graphic and intense and not for the faint of heart. When covering any sensitive topic in a dramatized fashion, there will almost always be controversy because many people have many different feelings on how to deal with these topics, and many people will have strong feelings on them. And therefore, even the occasional misstep will be viciously scrutinized, because if these things aren't done with the utmost delicacy, it could also lead to dangerous social outcomes. The first season of 13 Reasons Why was promoted under the guise of mental health discourse. In fact, if you watch the version now, you might see a disclaimer from one of the cast members stating that the intention of the series is to start a discussion. It was a significant marketing point. Therefore, at first when it came out, I kind of theorized that its messages probably bordered on inflammatory at points, but didn't do anything too egregious because overall it has still been well received. However, by the time the second season came, I began to, well, have second thoughts. The first season had been based on the book, as mentioned, however the second season completely deviated from that, and I felt that move veered more on the side of exploitive, especially given how the original series was promoted. I assume maybe there was just a heavy demand, maybe it made a significant difference to some people's lives, but regardless, given the moderate success of the first season, I understood why it existed. Nonetheless, this season was not well received by critics, and audiences didn't seem to be particularly ecstatic either, although it is difficult to tell how the committed fans reacted. I assumed this would be the end. However, I was rather irritated when I heard that there would be, in fact, a third season, a move that I found frankly rather insulting. But ho-hum, maybe it would be better. Okay, never mind then. I figured at this point a majority of the audience must have been but the most dedicated viewers of this show, who clearly felt that the messages mixed with the high school environment resonated with them. I really didn't see much additional value being drawn from it, and I also developed a sentiment of concern because if they're still trying to send these social messages about all of these topics yet receiving such a significant amount of criticism, they can't be doing a particularly good job. My concern here was that ultimately 13 Reasons Why had an audience who supported them on the basis of their takes on these sensitive issues, yet their artistic failure to carry through these messages could well have negative social ramifications, particularly if the intended audience were more vulnerable individuals. Now, I did not guarantee to find exactly this, but I also know that there has been a lot of debate over it, and I hope to at least provide my own stance on it, with a caveat of caution and nuance to those interested in watching the series. There's an inconvenient truth. Sometimes what might be most critically acclaimed or artistically bold or emotionally gripping may not be the best for an individual's health, and that's something that comes particularly to a head with a show like 13 Reasons Why, and for a show that attempts to tread both borders with some amount of sensitivity, I'd say it's ultimately a fundamental failure. And with the 4th season on the horizon, it should probably take a moment for some self-reflection in its messages. The crew behind 13 Reasons Why has made it clear that their intended audience has been those who are mentally vulnerable, and therefore that is something that cannot be discounted. I'm aware that my voice will ultimately have very little effect and the show will continue to steamroll its way into Brian Yorkie's bank account. But if this video makes anyone take another look at the show, then I consider that a victory. I'm going to be outlining the plot of each season before diving into my own personal thoughts and feelings regarding how this show tackles these issues and the success/shortcomings of this coverage. So without further ado, I suggest we get into it. I will preface this by saying that there will be spoilers. Let's go. Now, I briefly mentioned the premise of Season 1 while introducing this video, but I shall go into a bit more depth. There are two narratives that we have to observe. The first one being Hannah Baker, the deceased individual whose narrative is presented post-mortem on these 13 tapes, and mostly follows her account through the state of flashbacks. And the second being the recipient of these tapes, Clay Jensen, whose narrative is mostly followed through present day. There is an episode dedicated to each tape. We follow Clay as he listens to them and sometimes struggles to listen to them, interspersed with relevant flashbacks which run adjacent to Hannah Baker's narrative. We also follow Clay's own reaction to this, which may lead to certain behavior when certain truths are revealed. There are many various arcs, as would be expected on a TV show, but the tapes are directed at individuals whom Hannah feels contributed to her suicide, sometimes through merely being complicit in a culture or just being a straight-out rapist. Hannah's parents are planning to sue the school for their inaction, and other students who are the subjects of these tapes are trying to prevent the release of these tapes. Another student, Tony Padilla, keeps an eye to make sure each person listens to these tapes. There are many other minor conflicts and tensions, but I shan't focus too much on them. Now, realism is a really important point when staying committed to recreating these environments. Not every film or TV show has to abide by basic fundamental laws that we may expect from the real world. In fact, many don't, even the ones that may seem grounded in principle. But 13 Reasons Why has a few more rules to abide by because they seek to portray the human condition and environments that market relatability to their audiences. Therefore, certain elements of logic and realism have to be followed by in these instances. So realism will be discussed here, not just from a social perspective, but from an artistic perspective as well. I want to first focus on the premise, the fact that Hannah is recording the series of tapes and directing them at specific individuals following her death. This has probably been one of the major sources of the controversy, being called out by many as unhealthily indulging in revenge fantasy. Now, this is where we should talk about the portrayal of Hannah Baker herself. She isn't the sole focal point of the narrative, and therefore the writers have a bit more leeway to not present her as this all-positive protagonist. Therefore, I didn't immediately object to her having less than amiable intentions regarding the creation of these tapes, because ultimately it is the framing of the character that would define how she is presented to the audience. People don't always do the best thing. It's just important that there's some awareness of that.
See, I can guarantee that one of the reasons that you're still listening is that you really want to know. Who are the others? Who else is responsible for my death?
Unfortunately, 13 Reasons Why doesn't really have that. For me, I received the impression that Clay's present-day reaction was meant to be the core narrative that we were meant to emotionally follow, with certain deviations when he lashed out a little.
That shit's not helping.
I don't want to help.
And even those behaviors seem to fall on Clay rather than Hannah. Ultimately, their handling was a failed opportunity to look into the dangers of creating a series of tapes. Accountability doesn't dissipate after you die, and although the tragedy should never be undermined, at the same time, we shouldn't be afraid to analyze the morality of the actions themselves that come before. If the writing of other characters wasn't so on the nose, then the nuance may have been able to come through, because there are characters who dispute the release of these tapes, and even the details. For example, Jessica Davis, the subject of the second tape, tells Clay that Hannah was lying about certain details.
What she said on the tapes about us and Monet's? She's the one who stopped coming, not me. She's the one who ended our friendship, and she knew it. She's a liar. Was a liar.
However, by the end of the same episode, they used blatant dialogue to tell the audience that she clearly wasn't lying.
If Hannah was lying, why are you here?
It was such an underplayed conflict that it basically had no reason to exist, and it was a missed opportunity to look into the implications of such tapes. When someone takes their own life, they are more often a victim of some circumstance. However, at the same time, content published with knowledge of their impending death may be questionable in its information for two reasons. Firstly, a deceased individual won't have to face down the consequences of those narratives, and secondly, as they are a perceived victim, it will yield their post-mortem content more power, which which is exactly what is demonstrated in Season 2, but we'll get to that eventually. However, even with that said, it is revealed later on the tapes that she did get a detail wrong regarding another tape directed at Zach, a high school student who basically stole compliments from Hannah's compliment bag after she embarrassed him publicly. In the tape, she says he threw a compliment away.
I was hoping once you read the letter, you'd get it. You'd realize how much I needed those silly things you were stealing from me. But I guess I wasn't even worth a reaction.
And yet, it's revealed he actually kept it. However, this habit of getting details wrong doesn't appear again, so I'm not really sure what we're meant to do with it. The only basis that it would have changed under is if we were still unsure about the validity of the tapes, but the subjects of the tapes act in such a purposefully self-incriminating way that it's not a point of contention.
Your dad's a cop?
Yep. This is fucking brilliant. You can't touch us, Clay.
So ultimately, it just becomes this loose end, and we're left wondering if we should be lending the emotional value to the tapes that the writers clearly want us to. It's hard to tell if revenge is the direct motivation. However, it does appear at multiple points throughout the series. Probably the worst example of this is in episode 4, a tape dedicated to an individual named Tyler, a creep who took photos of her at her home and invaded her privacy, finally escalating when he took and shared a picture of her kissing another girl named Courtney. In her tape, she says this:
Maybe I'll never know why you did what you did. But I can make you understand how it felt to be me. That's why I'm outside your window, Tyler. And after people hear this, I bet I won't be the only one.
This is followed by Clay, the present-day protagonist, taking a picture of Tyler's bare buttocks and sending it to the whole school. Now, this was a bad idea for many reasons, and some characters even observe this, but there's little resolution or focus that says how bad an idea this was. And it was a really bad idea. Let's go into that. Bad ideas. They're common in this show. Sometimes that's okay when they're framed as bad ideas, but often you end up with this sort of ass-pick scene. No real closure because the tapes have moved on to their next subjects, and this leads to some real incoherence on actual morals. Scenes like those are made to stick out, made to shock, and therefore they stick in your head. And when I reflect on them, I don't really think they had any resolve or any conclusion that was meant to be presented to the audience. By the end of episode 7, and thus tape 7, Hannah Baker says this:
No one knows what's really going on in another person's life. And you never know how what you do will affect someone else.
Which is 100% true, but it's also a factor that has been neglected multiple times throughout the series. This is in part due to the fact that as a central narrative, Hannah's narrative doesn't really receive much scrutiny from the characters, and when it does, these characters are presented as mostly antagonistic and therefore not making a sincere case. The flashbacks are hard to dispute given how they are mostly promoted as faithful information, and the possible misinformation narrative isn't given nearly enough to add to that depth. And once again, I don't think this would be a central problem if Hannah's narrative was presented as inherently flawed, but it's not, and that means that she's much more presented as this martyr rather than the flawed person she clearly is as well. A lot of the time, I felt the extent that each individual was responsible had a level of ambiguity surrounding them, and by the end, I don't think people are remotely the wiser because the characters being held accountable never really have much of a discussion regarding it. Characters like Justin, Courtney, Marcus are so irrationally out to sabotage Hannah and make sure Clay doesn't release this information, it becomes a melodrama, which ultimately neglects that this could have been a poignant look at responsibility.
We can contain this, we just have to control the narrative.
You're deluded. The narrative is Jess knows Bryce raped her.
You guys would make shitty chess players. We're like 2 moves away from being checkmated.
Not necessarily. Not if we bring Bryce into it with us.
Bryce, the rapist.
Alleged rapist.
Fuck off, Courtney.
And it's not like I'm sure these characters shouldn't have angry or irrational interactions, but the best moments of the TV series were when they were having low-key conversations or moments when there was absolutely no dialogue at all, and we were finding out things about these characters that made them human too. Too much of the focus was on this cover-up plot, which just reached levels of ridicule at points, and it detracted from the grounded nature of how teens might deal with these things. I feel that there is such a melodrama, it made it hard for me to feel emotionally invested. On the contrary, one of the best characters was Hannah's mother, Olivia. Whenever she was on screen, I felt compelled because she conveyed the grief and pain from the experience of losing your own daughter, and that was something that I felt was so neglected elsewhere. She wanted justice, and she generated realistic melodrama. Her pursuit against the school for justice seemed well-founded yet disruptive, which is the right balance and one that isn't obtained elsewhere in the story. A lot of people have spoken about how each tape isn't really proportional against who they're directed towards, and I agree to an extent. I think the problem, however, is less that some of the tapes had less serious topics, but moreover the fact that they focused on the individual rather than the feelings that they represented. Abandonment, embarrassment, betrayal, alienation are all factors that can really drive someone to a deprived mental state. However, often they're a lot less accountable to individuals, more so just general environment and circumstances. And I feel the directed blame was a case of trying to prioritize melodrama over realism. However, the fact that Hannah seems to assign those feelings to an individual means that the actual feelings that drove the reaction seem underrepresented, and this is where the whole revenge narrative is at its ugliest. The problem is that the whole motivation of this impending lawsuit by Hannah's mother is that the high school culture was responsible, a culture that many people are only really guilty of being complicit, with a few exceptions. Because some of the individuals in the tapes don't necessarily do anything drastically terrible. However, as a recipient of the worst of high school culture, Hannah Baker should have been aware that naming people directly in a tape linked to her suicide could really negatively impact their lives if these tapes were released. The whole point was that high school students were creating social hierarchies of surface level judgments. What would make any of the people on the tapes above that scrutiny, some of whom clearly didn't deserve it?
This is why I didn't want you to listen to my tape. Because I didn't...
Because you wanted to keep your secret.
No. Because I didn't want you judging me for the worst thing I've ever done.
Characterization is another point that many people feel wasn't covered well enough in the series, and that's an important factor considering that the show makes the assertion of starting a discussion around mental well-being. For me, it's a mixed bag. There are some really good interactions that would reflect someone going through those stages of suffering, and obviously there needs to be some conflict. That's how plots are created. But there are multiple points where the high school seems ridiculously over the top. There's at least one scene where all the students just take their phones out at once and start smirking at the same time, talking amongst each other, and it's so contrived. Often they try to make Hannah out to be at the mercy of the whole damn school. I think this was because they wanted to frame it as her having nowhere to go eventually, but you really didn't need to do that to generate that feeling. Once again, if they could frame the paranoia that such rumors create rather than pretending that paranoia is only the reality, then they would kill two birds with one stone. They'd accurately represent the flawed state of mind that mentality creates, and they'd accurately portray the high school environment rather than merging the two and presenting that perception as truth. Something that would serve to perpetuate the idea that this scenario is much worse than it actually is. It panders to negative stereotypes that suicidal audiences are most prone to believing and presents it as verity. As a show that wants to connect with a more vulnerable audience, that sort of outlook seems rather inappropriate. As 13 Reasons Why goes, it presents itself as a discourse on accountability and responsibility. We observe a group of students come to terms with their participation in a toxic culture. This narrative could have worked if it was presented through the eyes of a neutral party or no party at all. But the problem is that we have the added detail that the narrative is presented by the victim themselves. This was clearly to add heightened conflict and more intimacy, but in doing that while combining it with the motivation to create a fully accurate portrayal, they succeed in making Hannah the perfect victim. The problem is that because the narrative is post-mortem, it is presented without challenge, and we never really learn much about Hannah or her imperfections. Even when she might behave in a way that seems irrational, it's never subject to much scrutiny because the narrative just continues. The only real dispute comes regarding whether she's lying, and we all know how well that plotline is pursued. In an attempt to keep the narrative as rational and coherent as possible, it undermines the fact that many suicide victims have mental health problems and other factors that will influence a person's mental state to drive them to that position. It goes too far to rationalize the situation, even if it notes that it is not a good option. It makes the act seem very calculated, which is what leads people to this revenge narrative. I don't think the premise necessarily comes across as vengeful, but it's very easy to look at that delivery and see it as just that. A really good example is in the final episode, where the flashback takes us to the school counselor's office regarding a sexual assault case, which honestly is something we'll get to very soon, but in this instance, the counselor isn't empathetic enough.
It happened, Hannah, and I believe you. But if you won't confront him, then the only other choice is to move on.
Yeah,
It's just what I'm gonna have to do.
But the flashback also goes the distance to make sure it is very clear that no one is blatantly in the wrong. But afterwards, Clay's narrative cuts through, implying that the counselor should have pursued her after she gave him the impression that she didn't want to talk. A very strong impression, I must add. There could have been legitimate discussion at that point for what more can and can't be done sometimes, but they just kind of leave the point unchallenged, ending on this romanticized final "who really cares" speech. People did care. And I think setting the bar that high justifies an unfair expectation from many people and undermines their own humanity in a way, and what they may be going through as well.
I think I've made myself very clear, but no one's coming forward to stop me. Some of you cared. None of you cared enough. And neither did I. And I'm sorry.
And I understand, I guess, what they were trying to do with the idea that everyone has a perspective. It is a running theme, but the problem is that vulnerable individuals looking to adopt Hannah's perspective would find it rather easy to do so because the narrative isn't presented as flawed enough. The show starts a discussion, but one of the points of view implied by the narrative dictates that an individual can be justified in taking their own life on the basis of circumstances assumed, which is something that I and a lot of people don't agree with. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding the increased rates of suicide following the show. It's hard to prove anything with post hoc measurement, and it's not an environment that would be ethically viable to manipulate. So cause and effect can never really be established. It's also impossible to measure how many lives the show may have saved, so I do take this perspective with a grain of salt. But typically the concern from many individuals is that such a suicide depicted and published can provoke copycat instants. Ironically, a copycat instant is depicted on the show when one of the characters, Alex, tries to shoot himself following this ongoing conflict. There are researchers who posit that it may well be the famous suicide scene that causes this. But I think it's more likely to just be the general theme of the show. You don't want to give people any reasons why, let alone 13, not unopposed at least, and the challenges against those reasons just come across as a bit lackluster. Now, the scene itself is controversial in other ways. In fact, it's so controversial that Netflix removed it altogether. Bit late for that. But I've seen many people praise it for its rawness and as a scene that feels important to the storyline, a convergence of the narratives. And I'll say it is powerful. However, at the same time, those scenes aren't going to be the ones that start discussions. They're going to be the ones to provoke emotional reactions, and although artistically it might feel like the right thing to do, socially I can see why a lot of people took issue with it. I don't know if the crew behind 13 Reasons Why anticipated that their audience were going to be as sensitive as they were. From what I understand, a lot of disclaimers have been placed in post-release, and I guess it would have been hard to completely ascertain that. But if they wanted to start a discussion, they should have been more considerate of the boundaries of that discussion, particularly when they appear to be trying to connect with that audience. I have a feeling that the whole discussion narrative was conjured up when they realized that they had some pretty severe incoming criticism. Maybe that's just my more cynical side talking. Another prominent couple of sensitive scenes that are shown include 2 sexual assault scenes, one of which where the main protagonist is a victim, one where she is witness. Both of these are perpetuated by Bryce, the main antagonist and probably one of the better written characters. He definitely captures the very two-sided nature that a charismatic jock can portray while still operating his power in very malicious ways. These scenes will be upsetting to some, and that's important to note, and I do leave that disclaimer here. I've ragged on it a lot, but I actually don't dislike Season 1 for what it was. I dislike Season 1 for what it claims to be. Generally, there's a lot that I liked in the show too, a lot of nice moments which challenge perception. As said, any scene with the mother was genuinely riveting for me, and Dylan Minnette does a pretty good job too, conveying a confused friend who doesn't know what to do. As a show, I was entertained, I was taken in. But there is a clear narrative, a clear voice that the show expects us to listen to, and without awareness, this can lead to shortfalls in the representation of the realistic worldview that the show attempts to convey, and could help people easily rationalize otherwise irrational actions that only make sense in the universe that the writers of 13 Reasons Why construct, playing into paranoia and mental clarity. This polarizes the debate and makes Hannah seem like a vengeful psychopath to some and like a martyr to others. Neither are true, and yet the show seems to retreat from the idea of nuance and excusing various shortfalls as inspiration for discourse. And that is the failure of Season 1. However, I will say that there are some good discussions where it touches on the ambiguities. There's this really good conversation between Clay and the school counselor towards the end.
Just to imagine what Hannah's last days were. Try to understand what led her there. I cost a girl her life because I was afraid to love her. You can't love someone back to life. You can try.
And there are a few of these strong interactions that I do genuinely respect. Generally, I prefer Clay's journey than Hannah's, and I think not having Hannah's narrative spelling it out may have created a better show. But there are only 13 tapes, and season 2 was around the corner. There was a lot they could change and improve on. Would they? No. The source material for 13 Reasons Why, the teen novel, was all used for the first series. This meant the creators had fewer boundaries holding them back and confining them to perhaps the trappings and shortfalls of such a premise. Would they squander this newfound freedom? The answer is an affirmative yes, and its failure, I'd argue, is even worse. By this point, they must have had the memo that they were starting a discussion, so their contribution would at least be valued on those merits as well. Series 2 takes place with the arch of the ongoing court battle between Hannah's mother and the school, whom she wishes to hold accountable for her daughter's death. This time, each episode is based on the testimony of someone related to Hannah, most of these individuals having been addressed on the tapes themselves. It was a nifty little concept on paper. One of the biggest problems that immediately yielded was that there was not nearly enough they could say, not as much as they would need to at least. In 13 Reasons Why, Season 2, they repeat a lot of the trials and tribulations that characters in Season 1 went through, leading to frustration at points. For example, the main protagonist, Clay, has significant issues opening up. The arc of the first season provides the feeling that it's good and healthy to open up sometimes, a nice message, and holding these problems in only leads to greater complications. In the second season, this problem repeats itself again, which leads to similar discussions.
Agreed.
We want to show you that we trust you, Clay, to do the right thing, to be a grown-up, to make good choices.
No more sneaking around. No more secrets. I promise.
Make a sound, we're both dead.
Now, it's not out of the ordinary for someone's personal issues to resurface. However, the feeling of relapse occurring was pretty depressing and frustrating for me to watch personally. Clay repeats a lot of conflicts and it becomes tiresome. It didn't really have much to add within the themes during the season, so what did it add? Melodrama. A ton of melodrama. There were people being beaten up, there were guns, there were knives, and at this point I felt I should be more annoyed. But at least they were making it obvious they were happy to portray this narrative that this was a quote, realistic high school environment. And I stress, there probably are some high school environments that are rife with weapons, safety hazards, and various other issues that shouldn't be ignored. However, the problem is, it doesn't work for the premise. The brutality of certain high schools in America is reflected in various socioeconomic conditions that need to be in place in such a narrative too. There's no normalization of violence in high school for 13 Reasons Why, particularly in the first season. It is treated with the shock and horror, yet it happens on such a regular basis that you can't help but see it as anything but forced conflict. Once again, to add weight to my point of rehearsed storylines, the main cause of all this conflict is the fear that those who testify will incriminate some of the worst individuals involved, which leads to various scares and sabotages and the rest.
Because the thing is, in high school, everyone's watching you all the time. You have to be careful.
Now, the high school represented in 13 Reasons Why was never the most realistic, but it could isolate the struggles that these students were going through and at least allow you to connect with them. That's not something that's really identifiable in the second season. There are some things that have happened between the end of the first and the start of the second season that I personally didn't like. Clay is now in a relationship with a character who was previously not involved at all in the storyline, and therefore I just felt awkward watching it as I couldn't see the chemistry develop. It was done for the purpose of creating a conflict that Clay keeps comparing other females with Hannah, but it seems forced, and any interactions that arise from it are extremely uncomfortable to sit through, because I could never really accept the premise that these two people were a thing.
I'll tell you what's weird. You still being in love with a fucking dead girl.
Don't say that. Please, that's not true.
This relationship ends pretty quickly when she's taken away to a mental facility, but it underlines another huge problem, which is just how easily people are emotionally provoked into hostile confrontation. One of the characters who finds himself in confrontation is Mr. Porter, whose mild-mannered counseling suddenly turns into high school vigilantism.
Jessica Davis is back today. I want to let you know I got my eye on you.
You and a dozen college scouts, but I don't know what that's got to do with Jessica.
Listen, you little shit. You go near the girl, you look in her direction, and I will fuck up your life.
And although you could argue it's the mindset of someone who has nothing left to lose, that sort of behavior could completely compromise your testimony in court and leads to nothing being achieved other than another angry black man trope box ticked. I understand it's an emotional time for people, but multiple people just seem so angry, entitled, and petulant. Probably the worst example of this is the now recovering Alex, who, following his failed suicide attempt, will just have these spontaneous outbursts out of nowhere. Now, on one hand, I empathize with his trauma. He has this memory loss, which actually isn't scientifically possible, but there are bigger fish to fry. His movement is impaired on one side of his body, and he's clearly suffering. Because the writers use his outburst to make him seem antagonistic rather than tortured, you end up feeling rather bitter towards him.
I want to see it.
Alex, honey, I don't know that you're ready to...
What? To know the truth? Or know I did it? Is this that you don't want me to think about it, or is it that you just don't want to talk about it? It's my goddamn note, Mom! I want to see it!
Often his eruptions are spontaneous, and they spend much more time focusing on his emotional reactions rather than any discussion about what he might be going through. It doesn't mean that those conversations don't exist, they are covered, but you don't really need more than one of these angry moments to convey what he's experiencing. By the second and third time, it feels awkward to watch and so painful for the sake of confrontation. I don't think it does the suffering of such conditions any justice. But with that said, he's far from the individual who's suffering the worst treatment of their mental health here. I think that award goes to Clay Jensen. As I said earlier, the tapes are over, you can't rewrite what was recorded, and it'd be hard to revive the character of Hannah Baker now that she is deceased. I guess what I should say is that it'd be hard to revive the character of Hannah Baker in a decent, respectful way, because they revive her, but my God. In the first season, Clay has visions of Hannah here and there, and seeing her face in other people and so on was understandable, given that he was clearly shaken by the ordeal. However, by the second season, she begins to talk and have full-on conversations with Clay. On concept, this could represent an internal monologue between a person who is rather torn on the right thing to do, but the writers make it very clear that they do not want it to be interpreted that way.
So let me get this straight.
Okay.
You don't know why you're here. You don't know how I'm supposed to feel about it. You don't know why I haven't seen you and have in fact tried not to think about you for months, and then you show up tonight.
Precise and accurate, in true Clay Jensen style.
So this left me with two options. Either Hannah has come back as a ghost, or Clay Jensen's visions of Hannah now talk to him. Neither of these options are particularly desirable to me, but given the fact that ghosts would not be thematically congruent with the outlook the show is going for, and mental health seems to be the focus, I'm going to take a guess and say it is the fact that Clay's visions are worsening. This could also be proven due to the fact that Hannah often cannot answer Clay's questions, even when the answers seem simple, thus suggesting she is a manifestation of his own limited perception, while also providing more frustrating conversation.
Tell me he was lying. Tell me Bryce was lying about everything. Now. Jesus, Hannah, tell me he was lying!
He told lies.
It was all lies. All of it.
Don't think about it, Clay. Think about hugging me. How it felt when we were close.
No. Stop it. I don't ever want to think about that again.
Many people have alleged that this is a sign of schizophrenia in Clay, or something similar. And I'd have to agree. And yet throughout the whole series, Clay just continues to live with this apparition of Hannah, having continuous conversations, the writers acting as if it's just nothing, as if he's just going along. It even escalates in exactly this way towards the end. Clay's vision of Hannah becomes worse, probably drawn from the frustration that they have been unable to obtain justice for the girls that Bryce has sexually assaulted. This vision of Hannah then begins to repeat Bryce's tape, the one which Hannah talks about her experience.
When I cried out in pain, you grabbed my hair like the sound of my pain made it better for you.
And this causes him to go to Bryce's house with the intent to shoot him before turning the gun on himself. At this point, the point should be this is bad and Clay needs help, and yet he's just escorted home and nothing at all is done about it. And okay, it can be difficult when we're suffering from these illnesses to open up about them, but throughout the series, this apparition is presented so passively that it never feels like the writers are even challenging you to think about it in that way. Other than the scene where she's literally screaming at him, she might as well be one of the family. But okay, maybe I'd be a bit more forgiving if this is given an arc and he confronts this vision, or at least there's some closure, but it's so unbelievably insulting that it annoys me just to speak about it. In the final episode of the series, they have Hannah's funeral. Clay says a eulogy. It's a good eulogy for what it's worth. But at the end, we just see Hannah's spirit exiting as if that's the closure we deserve to such a tortured arc. The vision's now gone. We can all be happy. Hooray! And in a sense, that sort of closure worked with how they presented her, but she shouldn't have been presented in that way with so little awareness to what she represented in Clay's mind. If you're not distracted by how poorly Hannah is written, you're pissed off that this is a concept that they thought was just acceptable to present as this thing. This was a problem, and I don't think it should be downplayed. Another person whose mentality is just completely butchered is Tyler. Now, Tyler, being the creep who photographed Hannah, is pretty much ostracized from many of the main characters, and this isolation can be dangerous. They definitely set the grounds for him as a volatile character, and in this season he finds belonging with individuals who, like him, are social outcasts. He partakes in various rebellious behaviors, which detail him attacking the social hierarchy in the school through vandalism and the rest. Now, this quickly goes downhill as he doesn't really understand how to fit in properly and mistakes Edge for cruelty, and eventually falls out of place with those friends too. Now, I could talk about how clumsily that is handled and how his actions don't really make sense, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt on that basis and say, okay, he is socially awkward, they don't have to make sense.
Go! Go!
So after being distanced from this group, he posts incriminating photos detailing his involvement in the vandalism of school premises. He is reprimanded by the headmaster and disciplined accordingly, or at least how they feel is accordingly. Now, up to a point, I could see how someone's isolation leading to apathy could drive destructive thoughts, and it's even shown subtly in some scenes, such as the one where he shoots a crow and has an interesting reaction.
Holy shit. Hey! Yo, dude! Dude, come look at this! Did you hear it?
Look at it, it was like flying like 30 seconds ago, and now it's just... I mean...
For those who are unaware, Tyler is meant to be the school shooter kid, and in certain episodes they're trying to outline his sensitivity to the possible radicalization that such environments might produce. It's a hard line to walk, because as always, you don't want to make the school shooter narrative seem too rational, you need to portray him as an outlier, but you have to make it real. However, probably high off the backlash they received for making it too rational in the first series, the writers go in totally the opposite direction and make his turn seem prompted by a scene that I'm going to have to describe. Part of his discipline for the vandalism incurred him going on a correctional course. He goes away for a certain amount of time and seems to come back as a changed man. However, on the first day back, a character known as Monty, who is known for being aggressive, violently attacks him with his goons in the toilet before ramming a mop stick up his anus. And this upsets him so much that by the evening he's just off to shoot up the school dance. The scene upset me a lot, to be fair. Mainly because I felt it was unnecessary. Not only do they really fail to document the gradual descent that many people in these scenarios go through, but they have to include a really ham-fisted scene that was basically used as a vehicle to justify why he did what he did.
Why the fuck did you come back?
And the misrepresentation doesn't stop there. Now, though it was a great misrepresentation, it was the perfect representation for what the show had become, a show that viewed sensitive issues as a pit stop rather than a natural source for discussion. It felt lazy, it felt exploitive, and it doesn't seem to understand how to initiate that conversation it seems to care about. Giving someone basic information or just showing them a really sensitive scene isn't enough to start a conversation. If I tell someone that the square root of 64 is 8 and then ask them to solve the Hodge conjecture, it doesn't mean I've sufficiently informed or equipped them to have that discussion. These scenes are the sort of thing that will shock someone and not necessarily give them much to say. I don't know how I was meant to respond to that scene. The scenes just discussed were the huge standouts for obvious reasons, and it's completely understandable. They were done for the sole purpose of shock value. With the first season's suicide scene, you could at least make the argument from an artistic perspective it had been built up appropriately. With this said, in season 2, there were plenty of other scenes that were now added in to embellish the timeline, which just felt frankly inappropriate. Most of these scenes were around the basis of Hannah, as shown by various testimonials. In the first season, the tapes were presented as a nearly wholly accurate representation of the environment that Hannah was subjected to. The second season uses flashbacks to add various details, which I suppose were meant to be twists. But all they did was throw into contention a lot of testimonials in her first season. One of the worst examples of this is Zach. In the first season, Hannah puts him on his tape for fairly minor reasons, but ultimately he was there for the loneliness that he represented and caused her to feel through his own actions. However, the second season creates this whole subplot where they were actually having some sort of relationship, which renders a lot of the original narrative that the first season presented pointless. Also, quick side note, they say this about 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah, well, this 2001 thing is supposed to be a masterpiece, so...
God, it's, so boring.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, but at least it's long. You should still see it, though, so at least when pretentious people talk about it, you can yawn really loudly.
Okay, cool, yeah.
I don't know exactly what they were trying to say here, but don't. Just don't. The second season felt like they were trying to fix the errors of the first season, but ultimately just ended up creating more errors themselves. Without the source material, they tried to grip onto characters who honestly didn't clearly have much else to them. So the writers just made them angrier, more volatile, leading to more conflicts. But also them just creating these new situations like they did with Zach, where individual testimonies reveal new information.
I'm sorry. So how come no one knew about it?
You were out of town last summer.
It wasn't on your tape.
Did you put everything on your tape?
I assume they anticipated this and tried to deflect it in the script here, but this is no valid response. It's not about Hannah including everything about a person, it's about including the relevant arguments for why a person led Hannah to take her own life. And this story paints Zach like a completely different person to the one portrayed in the first season, and makes Hannah's tape basically redundant. Another one who does that is Bryce.
Maybe that's why Hannah pursued me, because she'd never felt that sense of belonging.
They make it seem like she actually had something with him, before revealing that she actually didn't, but she still spent some time with him. So I guess it was meant to show that she actually isn't lying, but the fact that she omitted certain details like these in her tapes regardless wasn't a good look. It kind of ruins the first season for me. It's like the prequel film that no one wanted. It's like Shrek 3, but Prince Charming just keeps having flashbacks to Shrek 2. Don't try and fill in the gaps with Shyamalan-style twists. It's daft and unrealistic and only serves to sacrifice the character that you presented in the first season. Speaking of character assassinations, in episode 10, there is this character that I think everyone has forgotten, but I have not, because I was actually really annoyed about it. This is Sarah. She is introduced at the end of episode 9 and is thrown in literally the episode after as someone who has been a victim of Hannah's bullying at a previous school.
So you dropped out of school as a result of the bullying by these girls, including Hannah Baker.
Yeah.
No further questions, Your Honor.
This character has no other introduction and once again is used as a source for unnecessary conflict. However, arguably the most insulting element to her inclusion is that logically speaking, she wouldn't serve the purpose that the writers intended her to. Basically, she's there to undermine Hannah's credibility as a victim, to accuse her of being a bully at a different school. After all, if she was a bully at a different school, how could she be a victim at this one? This may work if her credibility was actually on the chopping board, but there are already numerous testimonies that say she was unfairly treated, even from people who misrepresented and attacked her.
Hannah had a reputation, and she didn't deserve it at all, but you know how kids are.
It's important to remember that the question was whether the school had failed to protect her, which was the point of the lawsuit. And if the prosecution lawyer had been more diligent, he could have easily flipped this to say that the school in that district, this other story of Sarah, also failed to protect this individual against high school bullying and harassment. This whole conflict changes nothing and only serves to fill out the 13-episode runtime. It was a stupid diversion whose themes were never really explored regardless. I guess the point of the courtroom was to try and illuminate how unjust many court decisions are, but their route of doing it was to write out the school's attorney as antagonistically as possible and then have the decision come out in their favor.
And isn't it true that your vandalism caused thousands of dollars of damage to Zach Dempsey's car?
I was angry at him. I paid for the damage.
What did you do when you were angry at Courtney Crimson?
I just took her to Hannah's grave.
Are you responsible for Hannah's death?
Yes. There are kids who did a lot worse. Kids who you let skate, who did things that you won't even talk about, and adults at liberty,
Request to strike that answer is non-responsive.
So ordered.
Now, I'm not saying that attorneys can't be this way, but it's simplistic and two-dimensional. At one point, Clay's mother was going to be the attorney representing the school, and although I understand why her character would pull out due to the vested interest, it would have been more interesting to see her battle with her own principles and her client's interests while still trying to understand who's responsible. Instead, we have this very vindictive character who we're basically told not to like. It's okay to challenge your audience sometimes, you know. The whole arc of Season 2 is utilized to tell the audience that we're meant to root for the school to lose, and when they don't, we're meant to lament the injustice of the system. But honestly, I'm not so sure about that. Let me elaborate. As I understand, the court case is meant to indict the school as culpable in Hannah's suicide. Now, in the first season, this discussion of responsibility is kind of juggled between parties, and the school environment is definitely brought up. And for what it's worth, there actually is a discussion to be had. Hannah's parents are initiating the lawsuit against the school, but it's also framed as an emotional decision and one done from people in exceptional grief, trying to find a reason for why their daughter took her own life.
Now, what can we do about that?
We could fight. You know, take on the monolith. We've got those pictures from the bathroom that you took. We have that list. And if that's not enough, then we're just gonna have to find something else, because we have to let them know that this is not a senseless tragedy, that there are reasons why this happened.
The school is presented as clumsy, shallow, and occasionally irresponsible, but never is it really implied that the school had to pay for what they had done. It was a barrage of conflicting feelings with no clear answer. In the second season, the show pulls out all the stops to make sure the school is shown in the worst light possible artistically, while circumstantially trying to present the situation as completely unjust. So there are fights, threats, and so on. Yet barely any of this is mentioned in court that could actually incriminate the school environment. In fact, I believe the only person who does openly mention it is Jessica Davis.
Bean, I found these just this morning in my math class.
Objection. These photos were not admitted into evidence.
One photo and it defines you. This is what they did to Hannah, and now they're doing it to me.
Order. Order.
If everything that happened in the school was reported in court, you might have a more watertight case, but nothing really is reported, and we're meant to be angry when the court comes to a decision that the school is not culpable. And after a while, I just reflected and felt that the decision was completely reasonable. The first series asked questions about responsibility, and the second series was just like, yeah, that was the school. It doesn't help that honestly, a lot of the questions from both the school and family attorneys were about individual involvement, implying that this individual behavior was accountable to the school. Now, of course, only one side was arguing this, but it essentially became an argument of tone policing. The school were such massive pricks, like the principal, for example. He's a big old prick.
And the most dangerous thing would be to believe somehow that Hannah's suicide is more than a tragic death. She's not a hero. She does not have lessons to teach us. And we need to recognize the sad and simple truth that she is dead and gone forever.
These guys are so bad that we're meant to side with the good guys. But that's the thing. It's one thing being right on the foundations of morals, but it's different when you're trying to carry out a legal prosecution that implies there should be reimbursements, and implying that the school didn't do its legal duty. It's a problem, and the question of how paternalistic schools should be is complex, because taking matters into your own hands comes with its own consequences. One might ask how involved parents should be in certain matters, and it was hard to prove how much the school knew while doing nothing. In fact, in the first season, one of the most incriminating factors, such as the inscriptions inside the toilet cubicles, was treated with shock, implying that there was little knowledge, or at least little provable knowledge.
How have we never seen this before?
Oh, well, faculty is not supposed to be in the student's restroom. You know, I can call the janitorial staff and see if they could repaint these walls.
I don't like to side with the big bad institution. Everyone knows how anti-establishment I am. And make no mistake, as they are written to be, they are not good people. But being not good people doesn't mean that you should lose a court case. I hate to sound nostalgic, but once again, in the first scene, there's this really sharp conversation between Hannah's mother and Clay's mother, who at the time was representing the school. I thought they'd make it some moment to morally signal, but they completely subverted my expectations.
Would you settle for, say, $200,000?
I think I would only settle for the truth, whether I liked it or not.
That's the sort of thing that they were just not interested in doing in the second series. In the first series, they tried too hard to make certain positions too justified, but in this one, they just tried too hard to say, no, this is what we meant, and I like it less. And if they did it with more attention to mental health, I'd probably be less likely to criticize them. At least it'd be a bit more socially conscientious. But as mentioned earlier, they missed the mark on that as well. It's the good guys, bad guys, TV drama trying to pass as a serious look on mental health, and its mental health coverage is just bad. However, if we are to ignore the ridiculously dramatic ending of the attempted school shooting, one moment that does manage to capture a bit more realism is the sexual assault situation regarding Bryce, and how hard it is for many individuals to come forward, particularly given their perception that someone like Bryce has due to his wealth and prestigious family.
I'm not gonna pay for a goddamn thing, Justin. I've got a legal team working for me around the clock. I've got state fucking senators that will talk about what a fine citizen I am. What have you got? A junkie mom and a deadbeat dad?
Throughout the series, he's presented as someone under pressure, but also very calculated in his method to protect his reputation. He's an awful person who has raped multiple individuals, and yet even when his victims go to the police, he only receives a minor sentence of 3 months probation. And his former friend Justin, who is from a significantly less privileged background, ends up receiving a 6-month sentence, despite the fact that his worst crime was being too intoxicated to fully understand what Bryce was doing and not being persistent enough. This was a somewhat decent narrative on the failings of the legal system and how it often comes out in favor of those more privileged. There's also a good narrative about loyalty and the price of, quote, betrayal. I would have much preferred them to focus on that rather than the prosecution of the school. However, I guess that wouldn't fill enough episodes. I think the one scene that I'd use to summarize the tone of 13 Reasons Why Season 2 is an alternative flashback scene for Mr. Porter, the school counselor. In all fairness, it's not a bad scene. In this reality, he chases after Hannah as she leaves and helps her open up. I kind of like it, but the context of it existing seems to be basically the writers feeling insecure of how people may have interpreted that scene from last season, either defending Mr. Porter or attacking him.
I can't let you walk out that door.
Why?
Listen, what happened to you was not your fault.
You don't know what happened to me.
Hannah, if my daughter were older, I would tell her the same thing. That men, they can control themselves. Everybody can, all right? Everybody knows whether they have it or not. And it was that boy's job to know.
If that scene had been the first season, I probably would have liked it a lot more, as it would have felt more ambiguous. If season 1 says, here's what you could think, season 2 says, here's what you should think. And I have to admit, I dislike the latter more on principle. There's nothing wrong with trying to reel in the suicide is justifiable narrative, but they also go after a lot of other narratives too, which, to be honest, weren't necessarily inherently evil points of view, and compromise many of the not-so-bad elements of Season 1. They are scrambling to appease their complaints, but don't have a grip on how to do it. Season 2 swaps out discourse for drama and waters down any substantial element that may have given it its appeal in the first place. It is not mental health oriented and commodifies a high majority of those topics. That is the failure of Season 2. But hey, we could talk about Season 3. They still have time to redeem themselves, so would they?
No.
Well, thank you for that contribution, but I have a...
No, you've spoken enough now. We're like 5 hours in and you haven't even reached Season 3.
I mean, that's what I was about to get into.
Yeah, well, I'm here now and it's my video, so we can't all be twats with too much free time, can we? Now piss off and let me talk about this garbage fire. The show is declining in quality so rapidly. I'm genuinely curious as to how and where it could possibly go next. If nothing else, Season 3 proves that there really is no rhyme or reason as to why any of this story is unfolding, aside from the fact that it is recognizable, popular, and probably boosts Netflix subscriptions. As if the fact that a show called 13 Reasons Why is already 39 episodes long wasn't comical enough, we're dealing with the aftermath of an event so distant at this point that it's very difficult to justify why any of this is truly necessary aside from the pure, juicy drama of it all. Season 3 shifts gears in such a way that would be fine if it wasn't treated like it's doing us some kind of virtuous service, as if this show is anything more than the melodramatic high school drama aimed at young teenagers that it indeed is. In all honesty, I kind of enjoy my yearly dose of this series due to the absurd levels they have to stretch in order to keep this angsty snowball rolling. At the very least, I find it to be somewhat comically entertaining as a trashy drama aimed at young adults, but I'm not sure that's the kind of feedback the creators were hoping for.
Wow! Tell us all about it!
Okay then, if Season 1 is about what led to the end of Hannah Baker and Season 2 is about the court case that preceded, then Season 3 is simply a whodunit murder mystery, with the hook or central question of the season being, who killed... All of the marketing was brandished with the question of who was responsible. Who did it? Who killed Bryce?
You're a horrible person. Yeah, pretty much.
At this point in the show, though, we're very aware of how evil Bryce Walker is. He's so comically maniacal over the first 2 seasons that it's obvious he was set up and marked as the major antagonist. And his comeuppance is the only narrative beat that has any consequence, besides the more pedantic pieces of drama that fill out the minute-to-minute of the show.
How long you been juicing?
In order for this season to come together, the writers decided that for this story to have any weight behind it, Bryce needed to come across as being more complicated and well-rounded.
You don't want to die. Come on, dude, you could kill the monster.
So you felt more conflicted over his demise. Problem is, you ideally should have been sowing those seeds since the beginning, to avoid it coming across as retroactive and kinda cheap. For a show that typically seems to have dealt in pretty clear absolutes, it's very strange to me that 3 seasons in is when they suddenly feel inspired to add a bit of grayness to the intentions of their more controversial characters.
What the hell happened? What have you done?
It reminds me of the tropey writing something like The Walking Dead often falls into, where a minor character suddenly gets an intense backstory that fleshes them out mere moments before they are killed, so their death appears to have more impact. With the way the show has been structured and written, it seems obvious to me that everything after the original material has been composed backwards. They seem to have a pre-prepared list of dramatic and controversial ideas that fit in line with what made the original book so famous, or infamous, depending on who you ask. And instead of writing realistic people that progress in a relatable and honest approach, they appear to force the square peg into a round hole to continue to double down on this idea that 13 Reasons Why is on the cutting edge of socio-political commentary.
I think it's mature and responsible storytelling on the part of Brian Yorkie and the writers. I mean, it's courageous too.
So how do they attempt to make you feel sympathy for a violent, serial abuser fiend? Well, their answer was to hammer home this idea that at the end of it all, despite the consistent and insistent amount of pure evil he has displayed in front of us, that, come on guys, he's still a person at the end of the day, right?
He's a f***ing person, Clay. Human being.
One of the main themes of this season is this idea that parents and or family have a huge role to play in shaping troubled lives. That behind broken or evil people is some kind of underlying trauma, be it a fiercely homophobic father, a distant, unloving mother, or whatever it may be. Which is an interesting idea to explore. There are a lot of movies I like that deal with these very themes. However, the script here is far too hokey and silly to sell any of it.
Knock knock, parent entering. Parent entering.
Let's not forget that at the start of Season 3, Bryce is known to us as the guy who started the initial rumors about Hannah, viciously sexually assaulted a minimum of 3 different people with more implied victims, started more nasty rumors, this time about Jessica, tormented Zach by messing with Hannah's locker, lied while under oath countless times, and probably many more horrendous acts I've forgotten about. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't really think that Bryce could be properly redeemed as a character under any sense, really, with what we've already seen him do. Like, this is very extreme. Like, what he did is abhorrent. This guy is eviler than the fucking Emperor. The only possible way I could see it going down was perhaps in season 3 his arc was to come to the realization of what he'd done and confess the truth to the police and take his punishment like a responsible person. Nah, he wouldn't be forgiven, but that's the only real way I could see you taking this character in a sympathetic direction and still maintaining some modicum of reasonable sense. It's true that suddenly Bryce seems to have some kind of realization in season 3 about what he's done and why it was bad. I assume they were going for a conflicted character who was fighting against the evil instincts that had defined him for so many years, which we learn seems to originate from a troubled family life growing up with parents that didn't love him properly. The show abuses the idea that if you have a sad backstory, that automatically makes the concept of evil deeds inherently more grey. However, as I already mentioned, it's looking for justification after the fact instead of having some kind of plan for the character from the beginning. It comes across that way anyway. Intentions aside, the execution of this character is where things completely fall apart, all for the sake of this ridiculous murder mystery. Bryce follows through on some of the more dastardly crimes yet in season 3. A particular standout moment for me being when he breaks into his dad's mansion to vandalize it, except it's revealed that he went to the wrong house and winds up threatening a small child with a knife, like an actual deranged sociopath. Well, I suppose he's only human.
Speak and you die. What the fuck?
Juxtapose that insanity against the attempts to humanize him, and you wind up with some brilliant unintentional comedy, such as when Bryce and his mother finally bond by throwing paint on each other.
No! No! Damn it! Speak and you die.
This is without even mentioning the very intentional and petty physical assault that Bryce commits in the penultimate episode. Story-wise, this is for the character of Zach to have motivation to beat Bryce to a pulp, so he can be a red herring for the real killer. But anyway, Bryce decides to plow his body at full speed into Zach during the chaos of a riot that takes place in the middle of an American football match in episode 12. This is, of course, fueled by pure jealousy because Zach moved in on Bryce's ex-girlfriend, likely ruining any chance of Zach's sporting career permanently. Might as well add a final destroyed life to the pile of chaos that this nasty character has left in his wake.
You're going to hell. Well, I'll see you there.
I mean, to be fair, he is only human. If that wasn't enough to prove how terrible this character is, I went to the 13 Reasons Why wiki, which is hilarious by the way, where I noticed some interesting, and pretty poorly written, observations. I find it very curious that for a supposedly grey character, he has a dedicated section on his wiki listed as enemies, where most of his crimes are conveniently listed in relation to the major characters. Oh god. Wow, what a horrible person. In the end, Bryce turned out to be a far more complicated character than people first believed him to be. His crimes are inexcusable, but he did try to make up for his crimes and seek some sort of redemption for what he has done. No, he didn't. You're talking about the same character who is listed under his personality section as a cruel, arrogant, spoiled, manipulative, violent, and selfish person, and is a very dangerous individual. That sounds like a more accurate description to me. It doesn't matter to me how many times he has a paint fight with his mother, apologizes to his victims, has a weird relationship with his dad, has a go at his meanie grandfather, or complains about the world not allowing him to change.
Trying to be better. Fucking world won't let me.
If anything, with the way it's presented, he comes across as a fairly consistent liar, who is never truly being genuine because as the viewer, we get to see that he really hasn't changed at all. It's even revealed that he's managed to fool multiple therapists.
Why not a real therapist?
Bryce had been to 3 already, and fooled them all.
As well as being responsible for having Tony's entire family get deported.
They already had my dad scheduled for deportation.
Jesus, Tony.
That's most of what bothered me about this character in this season, aside from one important detail, I guess, that being his relation to a new member of the cast. Annie, or Lil Annie, as I like to call her, is arguably the protagonist of Season 3, which is a strange decision for multiple reasons. She is essential to the structure of the season, with her narration being framed as a recounting to the police of the full murder mystery story, as you later find out. I don't really understand why it was necessary to add yet another person to this already huge cast, aside from the need to have a vessel that everyone can dump exposition onto and over-explain everything, as well as being a new face to have in a love triangle between Clay and Bryce. Yeah, there are so many love triangles it's hard to keep track. Lil Annie is written as an irritating know-it-all who loves the sound of her own voice and miraculously instantly connects with everyone that she meets, as a weak writing trick designed around shortcutting the need to have her relationships progress in a more believable manner.
Well, I look at you and I see you're badass.
She's a blank slate who is used to second guess and constantly question everyone to keep them spouting the awful dialogue.
God damn it, Arnie, I need you.
No! How is everybody today?
Oh my god, it is bad. She's also got a British accent for some reason, which I hate because I hate British people and their stupid accents.
Oh, I wasn't going to say anything, but thank you.
She quickly gets dangerously entangled in the entire affair, forming a strange relationship with Bryce and sleeping with him multiple times.
I slept with Bryce more than once.
It doesn't make her a very likable character, but at least she knows by the end it was an extremely immoral thing to do.
That's the worst thing I've ever done.
Yes, it was the worst thing you've ever done. She's the most proactive character in terms of moving the mystery of the plot along, with her motivation being that she wants to find out who murdered Bryce because of her intimate involvement with him. I find it odd that they insisted on her being the lead detective of the story, instead of the literal police officer, who has been established, I think since the beginning, multiple seasons. Turns out he's the father of the murderer too. So that would be inherent added drama, but I suppose that would distract from the high school tween nonsense.
We will get you whatever help you need, Justin.
Oh, spoilers. I decided to lump these characters together for a couple of reasons. First of all, as if one love triangle wasn't enough, they needed to have a pesky little cheating side quest going on in the background, with Jessica juggling a relationship with the two fellas at once to add to the theatre of it all. I already spoiled it, but it's revealed that technically Alex is the one who deals the final blow to Bryce, so he gets credit for the kill. It's fine though, because they agree to frame another character I haven't mentioned yet, Monty. We'll get to him later though.
You're a crazy bitch.
Yeah. And you should fear that. And you should fear that.
The murder scene is a complete mess because of the shift Bryce goes through depending on what is convenient at the time to the script. At first he tries to make a case that he's trying to change and that the world won't let him, even though he hasn't really done anything aside from continue to be evil. Even going as far as to have made a confession tape to give to people instead of just telling the police. Why would you do that? However, the moment he's helped up by Alex, he says he's going to destroy Zach and break his other knee.
I'm gonna fuck up his other knee and wreck his fucking life!
Which you might justify as him being angry in the heat of the moment. He did get his ass kicked after all.
I'm gonna fucking destroy him!
But to me, it comes across as if his true nature is to be a violent maniac, as we've seen for 3 seasons. Either way, Alex kills him and they cover it up. The characters are covering up murders at this point. The main cast is so morally bankrupt at this point that I'm pretty sure there isn't a single one of them that doesn't belong in jail for the seriousness of their crimes. I suppose you could make a case for some of them before people were being beaten and murdered and hiding weapons so the police don't find it. What is going on?
Is that where you guys dumped Tyler's guns? Correct.
But it's hard to root for these characters considering the lengths they're willing to go to lie and cover up the truth of what really happened. They appear to make up their own moral code as they go along and take the law into their own hands, which would be fine if this show was treated for what it is and not sold as if it's this important learning tool for young people to start having a conversation.
The show, which obviously is a weighty and important show.
Justin doesn't particularly get up to much this season aside from dealing drugs from the 13 Reasons Why coffee shop they're all obsessed with. I suppose this and any other show would be quite a big deal, but that's a relatively tame story beat compared to everything else that's going on. We're told that Justin has an intense bond with Clay, as he was adopted into the Jensen family last season, but I can't help but wonder why Justin wasn't used more in the investigation side of the mystery. It would have made a lot more sense to me to have Justin and Clay team up to find out the truth of what happened. It's not like a lack of motivation would be an issue, seeing as they both have fairly intimate backstories with Bryce at this point. I suppose we always have next season to explore the sexual tension of Justin and Clay.
I'd do anything for you. Anything.
Same.
This character cannot seem to catch a break. His first love killed herself, one lover had a bipolar breakdown and changed school, and his latest fling chose a serial sex offender over him. But that's not to say that this character is particularly likable otherwise. I have no issues with the actor, I don't blame him at all. In fact, the actors are probably the only reason anyone likes this show to begin with. However, Clay is so earnest and trusting of everyone, to the point where I'm fairly sick of him and his bullshit.
What?
His character really started to crumble the moment he put himself in front of an armed shooter in a misguided and dangerous attempt to be like a superhero like one of the comics he loves so much.
You just ripped my favorite character to shreds.
At first I was disappointed that the ghost visions of Hannah that were prevalent in season 2 had subsided, seemingly for good. However, they had to have at least one scene where, this time, Clay has a showdown with Ghost Bryce, which I quite enjoyed.
I may be gone from this earth, but I will be reborn in the bodies of 1,000,000 men.
My theory is that the next season is going to be, in part anyway, about some kind of mental illness that Clay is diagnosed with. My reasoning for this being that in one scene, his parents question Justin in a way that seems to indicate they have reason to believe he has something going on mentally. We'll have to wait and see on that one though.
Like he couldn't stop thinking about her? Or like he was hearing her?
Clay's main purpose in the story this season is to be another red herring. You're supposed to believe that he was capable of being the one who murdered Bryce. It even goes so far at one point that he's the main suspect in the case and is actually arrested. I fail to feel much sympathy for him though, because ultimately this entire situation could have been avoided if he wasn't such a moron and kept secrets from everyone. This school shooter aspect has spiraled the plot out of control so fast, all because of the way most of the characters agreed to cover for. Season 2 obviously ended with the bombshell of Clay stopping Tyler from going Columbine, so the results ripple into Season 3, and have to be explained away with the most moronic decision-making this group has made yet. Instead of getting this kid the help he clearly needs, and making sure he takes liability for his actions, they dividend responsibility between the group and implicate themselves to make sure Tyler is never given a chance to snap again and murder people. Yeah, that's their plan. Wow, these mental health expert children. Most characters are deeply frightened of what he's capable of.
I kept a gun.
You what?
And I didn't tell you guys because, I had a feeling that you'd get mad.
And Clay even admits that he has nightmares about being slaughtered by him.
In the dream, you pull the trigger.
Luckily though, Tyler is made out to be such a sweetheart to make sure to justify the ridiculous actions of last season. They try to make the case that it was all worth it in the end, that Clay made the right decision. Step in front of a shooter. Go on. That's clever, because he's just a human after all. However, being the complete imbeciles that they are, they decided to hide his bag of dangerous firearms in the water where fishermen constantly peruse. So obviously the season ends with a tease of the guns being found, implying that part of next season all sorts of drama is going to unfold. I'm glad, quite frankly, they deserve everything that is coming to them. Most of the scenes with Tyler are him apologizing for nearly killing his classmates, and coming to terms with the horrendous abuse he received in the last episode of Season 2 at the hands of.
So yeah, Monty kind of steps in as the lead villain in Liberty.
This character is fairly similar to Bryce. He's not quite as mustache twirling, but they take his character in a similar direction in terms of giving him a sad backstory, where it turns out he's a closeted gay with a nasty father. His main role in the plot is to effectively be set up as another red herring, and eventually be the fall guy for Bryce's death.
Monty realised that the cycle had to be broken somehow.
So the others can get away with murder and cover it up. He also conveniently gets killed off screen, as we're told by the police that he was killed in jail.
But Montgomery De La Cruz was killed in his jail cell
just hours ago.
I suppose you can have a crystal clear conscience, can't you, you monsters?
Okay, he was a human being.
Oh gosh, shut your face. This is the final character I briefly want to talk about because he's my personal favourite. He's the only one who calls the group out on their idiotic decision making.
This is bullshit. I'm out. I'm scared of you. And to be honest, I don't trust you.
Parent entering.
We even see how kind he is to Bryce's ex-girlfriend in the fairly preachy Planned Parenthood episode, which I haven't really talked about because...
I'm going to explain the procedure to you, and then we'll go over some paperwork, and you will come back Saturday morning. When you return on Saturday, we will take your blood pressure.
You should fear that.
That's most of what stood out about Season 3 to me. There's plenty of minutiae that could be talked about in more detail, but honestly, I could be here forever talking about how bad this is. As you can tell, and you'll especially know this if you've watched it yourself, this is easily the messiest and most ridiculous season yet. It so desperately wants to be taken seriously that it winds up becoming even more of a parody of itself than the depths it sunk to in Season 2. It's utterly tone deaf, nothing about the production is particularly interesting in terms of presentation, and even when they attempt something stylistic, it falls flat on its face. I'm of course talking about the ridiculous amounts of flashbacks the show is structured around, that have a slightly different colour palette. But the timeline is so muddled, it doesn't do much to help you understand where a scene is supposed to be taking place. The gross oversimplification of heavy subjects is as bad as ever, shock value is appreciated over any real character arcs, and the murder mystery angle is an extremely silly, pulpy beat that only adds to the overall melodrama of the show. Personally, I found it to be fairly enjoyable in a so bad that it's good kind of way, mostly because of the shock of where the writers chose to take this season, and I have to say I'm fairly excited for how they're going to attempt to continue this mess of a story. But this is no doubt the weakest season yet. They've written themselves into such a corner by forcing the show to go so far beyond its source material that at this point I'm curiously along for the ride, purely for how they're going to try to keep this material weighty and important while the stupidity continues to escalate. I suppose they're the winners in the end though. They kept this conversation going for a bloody long video, so I suppose that's the failure of 13 Reasons Why Season 3. It's really bad.
Thank you, I hate everything. What a delightful appearance. He truly is a loving person. Let's finish this off then. If 13 Reasons Why was just about the first season, we could have a fair discussion about how it treats its subjects, where it comes through and where it falls short. But by the time it's continuing to string along various audiences by 2 and 3 with these narratives that are frankly rather worrying when treated the way they have been, it reaches a stage where one has to ask whether it's worth it. With a full season on the horizon, I know there is not really much I can do. From what I understand, it will be the final season of the show, thankfully. But it seems mad to me that in the face of numerous critically acclaimed shows being cancelled, this one has continued to steamroll through. It sucks because I do feel that everyone deserves better. The cast deserves better, the topics deserve better, the audience deserve better. I'm sure there are a lot of people who care about this, but whoever's in charge just doesn't care enough, or doesn't understand enough to make it seem like they care. It's hard to make a show that has this discussion. I understand that. You can't expect to put your foot in the right place all the time. I know I couldn't, and there will undoubtedly be times where you deal with criticism for the handling of something that people may feel has negative implications. And that doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means it's a sensitive topic that people feel strongly about. However, with 13 Reasons Why in each progressive season, the creators seem to care less and less about the creation of narratives that actually discuss these problems, and more just touching on them for the sake of conflict through provocative reaction. And that genuinely sucks. It sucks that they can just put a little disclaimer at the start and think that they're sufficiently preparing people for what they're about to experience. It's like putting an age rating on a game. Who actually abides by that? Difference is that this is mental health and an assertion of realism in this world, and a lot of games are more clearly defined on the bounds of reality and fantasy. It doesn't change much, and it certainly doesn't change their failure to handle topics with nuance. And the only real reason that it's continuing is because it indulges a certain audience who is going to continue to commit to watching it. And I get it. There aren't too many shows that have attempted to portray mental illness in teenagers, though they're out there. But as many people have noted, this doesn't do it accurately, and it misses out on one of the greatest elements, the element of getting help. I would like to have seen a few scenes where a character has professional therapy, talks over the problems they're encountering. The problem is that they never seek help, and the fact that they try to talk about it with other students who are mentally volatile too leads to this heightened conflict. And it might be good to create a plot, but it's not really what you should be promoting. There should be a point where characters like Clay Jensen are seeking help, because by the 3rd season, he is just painful to watch. I hope at the actual end of the 4th and final season, he goes and gets help, because I feel like the only reason they've been holding off that is to build conflict. The school counselor is the closest they get to that solution, and even then, the only character who really has an ongoing relationship is Tyler in the 3rd season, and most of those discussions are nice, but not that deep. And the fact that it takes them 3 seasons to get there is kind of sad. Also, they still never really frame it as a clear solution, more just another plot element that's there. But I guarantee if some of these characters took some time out, they'd probably feel a lot better. But that's not what drives conflict. If you're suffering from mental health difficulties, there may be solutions out there. Not every solution works for everyone. I understand that. But I don't think 13 Reasons Why is good for vulnerable people looking for a quote discussion. Speaking as someone who has had his own mental problems, the show left me extremely emotionally drained. Probably around the midpoint of the third season, I felt at my lowest point mentally I had in months. And I don't think that was a coincidence, because everyone was just so unnecessarily angry. The conflict grates on you, all that negative energy. At the end, you're almost relieved they resolved it, but after being relieved, I felt conned. They just forced a load of bullshit conflict and then resolved it to make me feel better. It's like setting a building on fire, putting it out, and calling yourself the fire brigade. They've had 3 seasons to get this right. Going by their baseball standards, I'd say that's 3 strikes. If you've watched it and it's changed your life for the better, I cannot take that away from you. But I think they've really failed to change a lot of people's lives, and I'd be skeptical of how much they have helped the conversation. If you're not doing great mentally, this show wouldn't receive my endorsements. I think it's a placebo of sorts, and one that provokes a reaction that wears off rather quickly. At this point, I'd normally recommend a series that does handle it better, but to be honest, I haven't really watched that many. One that my friends always recommend is BoJack Horseman, which I definitely plan on watching soon. Though if any of my audience members would like to share some ideas of good shows about mental health in the comments below, then I'm sure there'll be people out there who'd love to hear them. If you're doing mentally well, 13 Reasons Why wouldn't get my endorsement either, because seasons 2 and 3 especially just outright suck. Overall conflict, contradictory values, and generally just what appears to be a motivation to milk the discourse rather than actually contribute to it. And the fact that it has persisted despite the criticism from people all over the creative and medical spectrum is the failure of 13 Reasons Why. We are done here. So yeah, that was the video. A really fun one. So much fun. I had such a great time making it, and I hope that I can continue having a great, fantastic time. I'd like to give a big shout out to the editors. They did a fantastic banger job. Fist bumps to all the editors. I don't know who you are yet, but I love you. I love you guys. Shout out to my Patreons, my big old patrons. Oh, patrons. I call them Patreons, but some people get annoyed that I call them Patreons because I'm just trying to define them from the regular patron. But I'll say patron. So shout out to my patrons. Hey, and all the ones that are $10 plus are on the screen right now. But we're not finished there. We got to give some more special shout outs because I've got some big names. I got a big shout out to Be More Cool J. What a cool dude. Brandon, Christopher Karras, Stanton, all $100 Patreons. And then my $50 Patreons, Caroline, Hypercube, and some Hullabaloo. I did it in different order this week. You see, I'm feeling extra spicy today. But thanks again, guys. You're all the best. You're all the dogs. And I appreciate and love you guys. So I don't really have much else to say. Keep up the fantastic work. And if you want to speak to me, you can reach out to my Twitter. That's probably one I reply on the most, though I haven't been getting to DMs too much recently because I've been busy. Probably that's the best shout. Discord in the pinned comment. Facebook also in the pinned comment, though I haven't been using that much recently. Instagram too. I sometimes chill on there. So not too much else to add. Have a good week. I've given up with the world, but I'm still here. So take care, chaps. All you fantastic chaps.